Stanford University.
A lot of people say, well, you know, why is something that could be relevant for a little bitty country like Denmark? Why and how could it be relevant for me or us? And I'll quickly say from the beginning, I don't think our recommendations are interesting to you in any way because they belong to Denmark and then the Danish situation. But I do think the analysis that we did is relevant for everyone. Now, in the letter of invitation that I got here, and I really appreciate all the people I'm getting a chance to talk to. It's really wonderful to be here. I was born and brought up on the East Coast. I went to school on the East Coast. I must admit I've never been in California before, so this is really a fantastic experience for me. Now, in that instruction that I got, it said, we know everything about climate, so don't start by telling us about climate, which, of course, is like putting the red flag in front of the bull. So the first thing I want to do is talk about climate. But I want to talk about it maybe in a little bit different way than we usually talk about, because I think it's important sometimes to take the helicopter view on where we are. It really is very, very seldom that a change in scientific thinking within the natural sciences has that sort of stomach reaction that climate change does. Everybody has an attitude about or some kind of an opinion about climate change. I mean, we have potentially serious candidates for the Republican presidency that are candidates that's claiming that, you know, being very proud of the fact that they've never bought into that hoax. So it's surprising to me that usually when we as natural scientists get along about our business and nobody really cares, that this really has taken everyone by storm. People think they know me because they've seen a picture of me or seen me on television or something, and I've actually had people stop me on the street, look me deeply in the eye and say, I don't believe in the greenhouse effect. Okay? First, I didn't know how to deal with this, but then I figured it out. You take the other foot forward, look them deeply in the eye again and say, that's very nice, how do you feel about gravity? And I've tried to think about when was the last time that I think a change in scientific thinking had this sort of effect on society that climate change does. And I think actually it was in 1859 when Charles Darwin came with his book on the origin of species. Now, what did Charles Darwin really do? Charles Darwin challenged the way that humans, our ancestors, thought about themselves and their relationship to nature and to the rest of the planet. The Bible had taught us that we are somehow above nature, better than nature. We had a God-given responsibility, not only a right, but a responsibility to bring civilization to that wildness that was nature. And here comes this scientist and says, yeah, we aren't actually better than nature. We're a part of nature. We're a species like all others. In fact, we're an ape species. Ugh, that didn't go down very well, did it? But even worse, Darwin challenged the economic paradigm of 1859, because in 1859 there were very many men, and it was men who were allowed to think then, not the other type, but there were very many men in 1859 that didn't think you could have economic growth or economic stability if you didn't have slaves. Now, this scientist comes along and says, listen, those aren't animals you're selling, they're actually your brothers. That kind of takes the carpet right out from underneath the business. Now, what does all this have to do with climate change? Well, most of us, and I use that carefully in this country, but most of us accept the fact that we do belong to a species like all others, an ape species. But the next step, that the combined activities of that ape species could be enough to change the way something is huge and something is so incomprehensible as the whole planet works, that's really a bitter pill to swallow. And what's more, the idea that humans might be impacting the climate system, the Earth system, challenges the economic paradigm of 2012. Because what was it that we actually traded the slaves in for? It was machines. What did those machines run on? They ran in the first instance on coal, later on gas and on oil. So in many respects, we can say that we haven't come very far since 1859. I think actually we have, and I'll get into that here, but there are a lot of parallels between what happened in 1859 and Charles Darwin and what we're seeing now around climate. And why is this important? Well, often people come to me and say, you climate scientists haven't convinced everyone yet, and until we've convinced everyone, then we can't do anything about this. Well, if you think about it, it's been 152 years since Darwin came with his theory of evolution. And in the most powerful country on earth, politicians are still discussing whether or not we can teach about Darwin's theories in the public schools. So it's very difficult when, actually, I've just recently read that over 40% of Americans actually say that they believe that God created this planet within the last 10,000 years. So given those sorts of odds, I don't think it's particularly surprising that we're having difficulty convincing people about climate change. But do scientists really have good evidence for the fact that human activities, combined human activities, can influence the way the Earth works? Well, yes, they do. This comes from a book that I and also Pam Matson, who I guess is out traveling now, but Pam Matson and I were authors on in 2004. What you're seeing here is 12 panels that also show something about the human enterprise, as it were. We have they all started in 1750, they all end in 2000. This is population, GDP, direct foreign investment, damming of rivers, use of fresh water, use of artificial fertilizer, number of peoples in cities, amount of paper we consume, numbers of McDonald's restaurants as a proxy for globalization, numbers of cars, numbers of telephones, and international tourism. And as you can see, there's been a huge increase in human activities over the last 50 or 60 years. Now, if we turn to the Earth system itself and do 12 panels measuring something about the Earth itself, again starting in 1750 and ending in 2000, we have 3 different kinds of greenhouse gases here. We have CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane. Here we have the size of the ozone hole, temperature in the northern hemisphere, flooding events, the percentage of fish species that are commercially exploited, that are either overexploited or fully exploited at this point. This is an interesting one, actually. This is where we remove mangroves in the Far East to develop shrimp farms so that we all can go to the local supermarket and buy tiger shrimps for dinner. This is oxygen depletion events in coastal waters. This is the conversion of tropical rainforest to domesticated land. This is the the amount of terrestrial wild nature being moved to farmland, and this is the loss of global biodiversity. And you can see these curves look rather exactly like the ones that we just had, but being able to correlate what's happening in the Earth system and what's happening in human activities doesn't necessarily show cause and effect. I mean, as you all know, the number, or you maybe don't here, but it is true that in Germany, the birth rate actually increased at the same time that the stork population increased. And there's no scientific evidence, I hope I don't disappoint you, that the babies came from the storks. So we have but in all of these cases, except the great flooding events, there is good scientific evidence that there's a cause and effect relationship between the human activities and what we're seeing here. Now, this caused the well-known English economist, Lord Nicholas Stern, to declare that business as usual is dead. And it was kind of interesting. I was giving a talk like this in Japan, and it was a very big meeting, and there was some big politician that was sitting on the panel together with me, and he said, listen, I have a very hard time imagining us, asking for fewer resources and, using less. And I said, well, how do you feel about this? Do you have a hard time or an easy time imagining that this could continue? And he had to admit that he had some difficulty in assuming that it could continue. Now, all of this, of course, the fact that we're having these effects is, of course, related to the fact that we are asking, the root cause for all of this is that our demand for resources, natural resources, is beginning to exceed the supply for some critical resources. And in this sense, we can consider climate as being one of the resources that we're looking at. Because what's climate all about? Climate is all about, we have a global garbage dump in the atmosphere that takes our greenhouse gas wastes. We know when politicians say that they want to keep the temperature, the human-caused temperature increase to within 2 degrees, we can calculate how big that garbage dump is, how big the resource is. We can also say that half of it is used, and we can say who used the first half. So what's actually going on at the moment is a discussion about who should have rights to the second half. Those of us that have used the first half could turn to those who haven't had a chance yet and say, okay, all yours, go for it. I don't think that's going to happen, and that's one of the reasons why this is as difficult as it is. But there are many other resources as well. We're usually used to thinking of provisioning of material resources such as oil and gas and fossil fuels, and we're getting to them now. But there are also what we usually call goods and services or ecosystem services that are regulating or supporting services such as the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and so on. Now, these provisioning resources, we have a price for oil, we have a price for gold, we have a price for a lot of these sorts of things that we dig out of the ground. We're having a really hard time getting a hold of a price on these types of resources, or even knowing how much is actually there to be used. And I was involved together with Eric actually a few years ago in a study planetary boundaries where we actually, this was in Nature in 2009, but basically what we do is we go in and try and assess what is the global supply of some of these important resources. Now, I don't want to talk very much about this paper. I want to tell you what we did in our climate change panel, but I think this is an important background for it. And what we said was, listen, humans have been here for 250,000 years. There have been a lot of very major climate changes. This is looking at temperature. This is a proxy for temperature. You can see there have been massive climate changes in the time that our ancestors were on this planet. But how did they deal with those changes? They dealt with them in two ways. One, they died. We know from genetic material that we were down to very few individuals. The other thing they did was, when the water got up to here, they went over there where there wasn't any water. That worked when you were tens of thousands of a species. It doesn't work so well when you're between 7 and 9 billion. But what's more interesting is that it's in this last period here, the last 12,000 years, the Holocene, that the climate has not had these major changes. It's been very stable, and that's the period when our species has really taken off. About 2,000 years into this period, we discovered, our ancestors discovered how to do agriculture and so on, and that was what broke our dependency on being able to find food and so on, and is the basic reason why we can be 7, soon 9 billion people on this planet. So what we did was to say, okay, what were the things that changed really a lot here? We want to make sure that we as humans don't go in and change them a lot now, because we might risk this kind of thing. Doesn't mean we understand exactly what caused these, but we just think we ought to try and keep those sorts of resources that change dramatically here to not cause those dramatic changes. We identified 9 different important parameters where we tried to go in and say, how far can you push all of these boundaries? And for 7 of them, that is to say not chemical pollution and not particles in the atmosphere, we couldn't come with a proposal for how big the supply is of these resources. But for 7 of them, we did. And the only thing I want to use this story for is, because I think this is a very compelling picture, we then can go in and say, okay, if this is what we think the boundary is, and okay, we can discuss if it's really there, or whether it's somewhere else, it may be in here, it may be out here, but somewhere near here. If we think the boundary's here, we can go back and we can plot what was the human, that's the supply. So we're talking supply here. What was the human demand for these resources? Well, before pre-industrial times, it was so small compared to the supply, we didn't need to worry about it at all. As time goes on, we get into the agricultural revolution in the mid-1900s, and we start moving out of some of these axes. And now we're in a position where we believe for 3 of them, we're on the wrong side of the axes, but we're moving out on some of these others as well. Message here, climate change is just the tip of the iceberg. We are going into a phase of resource scarcity. Being on the wrong side of the boundary doesn't necessarily mean something awful is going to happen. You can have high blood pressure without it meaning that something awful is going to happen, but it does increase the risk that something awful might happen, so we put it down. So there's the chance to go back on these, but it's also worth noting that we're on our way out on the axes on a lot of other ones. So climate change is the tip of the iceberg, and this problem of resource scarcity is not going to go away. But this is the first time in human history that the demand for some of these essential natural resources is beginning to exceed the global supply. That means, there's a good news here, that means that environment can no longer be regarded as being distinct from economic interest. We have this tradition in our society where we say, okay, here's economy, that's the most important. If we're feeling really wealthy, then we can actually maybe worry a little bit about what's happening over here on environment, but only if we can afford it over here. But as resource scarcity becomes what we compete on, that brings environment right into economy, and it's much easier to couple the two problems, or the two paths. It also means that future economic growth can only be based on more efficient resource use and or the development of alternatives for resources where supply cannot meet demand. And that's of course what we're seeing with renewable energy at the moment, because we recognize that supply will not continue. And what all of this supply and demand means, among other things, is that we need to develop energy systems that do not depend on limited resources such as oil and to a certain degree gas, although I recognize that there are now new methods of getting gas online that we may or may not choose to use. The United States is much more enamored of fracking than most of Europe is, I have to say. The other thing it means is that we have to greatly restrict our use of the common atmospheric garbage dump for greenhouse gases, and fortunately these two things are linked. Now, someone today that I've talked to said, oh, well, you know, we've done exactly the same thing in California as you've done in Denmark, because we did a study of how we can reduce our CO2. No, that's not what we did. We did a study on how our energy system can become independent of fossil fuels. And then we calculated as well the effect of CO2, but the object of the exercise was not to reduce emissions. And I think that's very important. I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, why did I say these two things are related? Well, here's the challenge. We're looking at oil here. This is from 1990 to 2030. This blue area here, that is the production, the predicted production from existing oil fields at the moment. There's some new forms coming online, but basically what this picture tells us is that in 2030, if the global demand, not just the American demand, if the global demand for oil is still the same as it is or that it increases, that we're still as dependent on oil in 2030 as we are today, then this entire gray area, that is to say about half of the oil that we need in 2030, has to come from sources that either are not found yet or have not come online. They're there. I'm not standing there and saying we're going to run out of oil by 2030. Sooner or later, oil is going to get too expensive to use, whether one likes it or not. But we know we're burning it every year at a rate that it took nature on the order of 1 million years to build up. And that's borrowing resources at subprime loans conditions, and we know what happens to subprime loans. I have a neighbor at our summer house in Maine who maybe belongs to the slightly more conservative end of the political spectrum in this country. He says to me, listen, we've got oil here for the next 100 years. We just need to dig in Alaska. I don't know if his numbers are right. May well be. But I say to him, listen, I think that's great. Just keep digging, because we don't have oil for the next 100 years, so we'll figure out what we can use instead, and you can buy it from us in 100 years. So it's going to be there in 2030, but it's going to be more expensive. I won't refer to what's happening at the gas pumps at the moment, and I really don't think it's Obama's fault. Our gas in Denmark now costs $11 a gallon. So we have rising prices, we have fluctuating prices because supply and demand is on a knife's edge. And we have the other problem that the known oil and natural gas reserves are actually concentrated in a few countries. Now, I'm not going to pull any Middle East card. Most of what we buy is from the Middle East. But if your energy security is in the hands of a very small number of countries, it doesn't matter who they are. I don't know who your friends are going to be in 2030, 2050. You're very vulnerable. So we have this problem, at least in Europe, we have right now, we have over 85% of the oil that we use in Europe is imported, and by 2030 it'll be over 90%. So we're exceedingly energy vulnerable, just as China is, by the way. The other thing is, if you look at our fossil fuel profile in Denmark, or our emissions profile in Denmark, our emissions here in 2008. The EU has a goal of 80 to 95% reduction by 2050, and you can see if we don't get rid of fossil fuels, we haven't got a snowball's chance in a very warm place of getting to where we want to go. Now, all of this has arrived, or has given us arrived us at the goal where there is a Danish national goal at the moment to remove fossil fuels from the energy system, including the transport system, by 2050. This is supported by all parties in Parliament. We are having a healthy democratic discussion about how fast do we want to go, what are the milestones we're going to use underway, but nobody in Parliament is discussing whether we want to go there or not. It's totally agreed that's where we want to go. If you interview Danes, and Greenpeace did it when we came with our report, about 90% said that they wanted to they believed Denmark should become independent of fossil fuels. And removing fossil fuels from the transport system will result in at least an 80% reduction of emission in 2050 compared to 1990. Now, the new government we have has made the short-term goal. This isn't accepted yet. It's under negotiation at the moment. But this is the negotiation paper they've put forward, where they say we want a 40% emissions reduction by 2020. The previous government, the Conservative government we just voted out, said they wanted a 33% reduction by 2020. The new government says they want 50% of our electricity should come from wind in 2020. The old government said 43% of our electricity should come from wind in 2020. The new government says 36% renewables in energy system by 2020. The old government said 33%. You have to understand the reason I'm giving the old and the new numbers is I think the chances of landing this with an agreement where all parties are involved is huge, because the distance between them is not big. The new government also says that there should be no fossil fuels in our electricity or heat production by 2035. I'm less convinced that that one's going to go through, but we'll see. Now, how did we get to where we are today? Well, first of all, we had our Climate Commission, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. It only existed from 2008 to 2010, so it's not like it's still continued. I was the chairman when it was there. It was established by Connie Hedegaard, who is now she was the Minister of Energy and Climate in Denmark at that time. Now she's the EU Commissioner for Climate. And Connie has, bless her heart, all the way along combined the energy and the climate discussion. So all the way up to COP15, when people were trying to discredit the science that goes into our climate understanding for various mostly bad reasons, Connie would say when she was confronted by the press or by a skeptic, it doesn't really matter to me. As a politician, I don't dare take the risk that the 2 to 3% of relevant scientists who are in this field aren't convinced. I don't dare take the risk that the other 97% are wrong. But even if that 2 to 3% is right, what have we lost by getting rid of an energy source which is killing people, which is costly, and which is leading to geopolitical conflicts? So from the very beginning, she had these two things together. Bless her heart, we did not go into climate constipation after the COP15 in 2009. You have to also understand that Denmark in the 1970s was brought to its knees by the oil crisis. All of Denmark's electricity and heat in the 70s was dependent on oil, and we couldn't get oil. You couldn't drive your cars on Sunday. There was the country was brought to its knees. And the politicians in the 70s said, okay, let's get rid of oil. They made the goal. We'll get oil out of our electricity and heating system. They did. Unfortunately, they put coal in, which is what's giving us our problems today. But that means that people in power have seen this happen before. They know that it can happen. The other thing that happened from that energy crisis in the 70s is that a lot of Danish companies got involved in energy efficiency and in alternative energy. And if you look at the Danish, it's now a little bit better. It's almost 13% of our export portfolio in Denmark is based on energy efficiency and alternative energies. That makes us #1 in the world in terms of this. Now, in terms of the importance of it for our export portfolio. What this also means is that our industrial organization is in a is in a very difficult position compared to most industrial organizations. Because if you're going to have an energy change, the energy change we're talking about constitutes a revolution. In revolutions, there are winners and there are losers. Many of the winners don't know who they are yet. They're not even born. So they're being very, very quiet. Believe me, the losers know who they are, and they're being anything but quiet. So if you go to the European Industrial Organization, whatever, they're again this. This is who may be important at some point, but not unless we have a level playing field, not unless everybody has exactly, oh, no, this isn't our party. Whereas the Danish Industrial Organization is in that sort of awkward position that a very large component of their membership sees this as themselves being winners here, and it just can't go fast enough for them. So you don't get the opposition from the industry in Denmark that you do in many other countries. By the way, one of the reasons why Denmark wants to try and be the first to make and Denmark is the first country in the world that has an explicit goal of getting rid of fossil fuels, building a new energy system without fossil fuels by 2020, because they figure everybody's going to have to do this. We're going to have the knowledge that we can sell other people, because this was easy, because no one else was interested. Getting a gold medal at the Olympics when only one runner shows up is pretty easy. China invested $53.5 billion last year in energy efficiency and new technologies. Korea's investing $50.3, I think it is, billion over the next 5 years in this. So there's a lot of big players on the field who want to compete with us here. So we're going to find a new niche, one that others can't do. The other is the prospect of dependence of oil import is very concerning for Danes, because they've been through the 70s, and also because we have seen the Mohammed crisis, which is when one of our newspapers in Denmark a few years ago drew some pictures of Mohammed, and that was not taken at all well in the Middle East. There was a lot of boycotting of Danish products, there was a lot of burning of the Danish flag, and so on, and most Danes feel they don't want to be dependent on the Middle East for their energy. So the secret to the Danish commitment for the vision of independence from fossil fuels, I think, is the fact that Danes believe there's something in this for me, if nothing else, energy security. And I think we have too much of our climate communication is based on gloom and doom. And I don't think anybody does anything when you communicate it through gloom and doom. The commission was 10 people. These were our terms of reference here. You can see we started, basically it was all about reducing and ultimately eliminating dependence on fossil fuels. And we had to also look at a lot of other things. Many of these clearly have the finance ministry's name in small print. But that was okay. We were 10 people, 5 economists. If I've learned nothing else, I've discovered that economy is not an exact science. But we had 5 economists and then 5 climate and/or energy. And some of our economists were also energy economists, I have to say. What we did in the commission is we said, okay, we have 2 equally important goals. One is that we need to have independence from oil, coal, and gas. The other is that we need to reduce our emissions for EU reasons. We know this has to happen by 2050. This we know has to happen at some point in time, but we don't have a date. But because we have a date here, let's do our initial analysis to say, can we do it by 2050? I should also say, we said that independence for us was getting it totally out of the system. And why was that? Well, people have said to me, listen, I drink alcohol, but I'm not dependent on alcohol. No, I hope you're not. But if you're planning your calorie intake on the alcohol that you're drinking, then you are dependent. So there was no way that we could continue, if we were going to make ourselves independent, there was no way we could continue with fossil fuels in the system. So the first thing we said was, okay, let's say we can do this by 2050. We did all of our analyses, and it turned out, yeah, we could. We said, well, let's see if we could do it earlier. And it turned out, yeah, we could probably get fossil fuels out of the heat and electricity system by 2030, but it would be more expensive because we'd have to retire infrastructure before it had done its duty. You may remember the new government says they want by 2035 to have fossil fuels out of the heat and electricity sectors, maybe related to our conclusions. We had a number of principles that we worked on, and I think 2 of them bear a comment. Denmark is not an island. Well, that's important for 2 reasons. One, we are a part of an energy system where we buy and sell. from other countries. We shall continue to do that. The other reason it's important is that how expensive this is going to be for Denmark depends on how ambitious the rest of the world is. The rest of the world is exceedingly ambitious on this agenda, then biomass prices will go up quickly, but fossil fuels won't, and vice versa. So we did two references. One where we said the rest of the world, we're going to go for this 450, this, they're really ambitious, and the other one where we said no more climate legislation is going to come into place. Neither one is a prediction of the future. It's simply to get two endpoints, and the truth of the matter is we're probably going to end up here somewhere. So that's what we did. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is biomass. Biomass is interesting. It's also a challenge. Biomass is a renewable resource, but it's not an infinite resource. And that means that we can expect the prices of biomass will increase in the future. So depending on what happens with biomass prices, it'll have an impact on how our energy portfolio will look in the future. And therefore, we assumed two different biomass price scenario. And we assumed, because there seems to be enough in the EU of biomass to be sustainably produced until about 2030, we just assumed small changes, incremental changes in biomass. After about 2030, we gave it a rather large increase. How did we do that? Basically, we assumed that you'd pay the same for biomass as you would for coal, because you're substituting biomass for coal. And remember, in Europe, we also have a carbon market, so in addition to the coal price, we have a CO2 price in that. Our results were that we could be independent of fossil fuels by 2050, even though our service demand for energy will about double. That doesn't mean we'll be asking for twice as much energy, because we're putting in energy efficiencies. I'll get back to that. But we're not holding back. We're not living in caves. We're continuing to develop. The technology we need is available today, but we should continue research because more will become available and cheaper, and there will only be a very small additional cost as dependence on fossil fuels will also increase. Now, what did we do here we did two different macroeconomic models, because my economists didn't believe their first round, because it actually showed there really wasn't a very big difference. This is assuming the growth rate assumed by the finance ministry. People say, do you really believe that? I don't know if I do or not, but if I didn't use the finance ministry's official growth rate, then I'd spend all my time explaining why I didn't use the finance ministry's official growth rate. When you do this sort of thing, it's really important you're speaking the same language as the politicians. So fine, if we can do it with that high growth rate the finance ministry is assuming, we can do it with a lower growth rate. And basically what this says is we'll be about twice as rich in 40 years' time, and this is what our energy costs accumulated during the period. The difference in energy costs that we've used over the next 40 years is about 0.3%, or less than 0.5% of GDP in 2050. In other words, about 3 months of development. And you could consider that as a kind of an insurance policy to ensure that we will have access to the energy we need there. And people say, oh, but I don't want to pay the price. I don't want to pay more for my electricity. Sorry, guys. Electricity, energy is going to get more expensive. It is a scarce resource. And we've done this analysis here. Right now in Denmark, we pay about 2 krone per kilowatt hours. These are still 2008 prices, but what we expect to pay in 2050, with wind power, about 2.6 krone, and without wind power, going on fossil fuel still, about 2.5. So basically, no difference. And the reason for this, of course, is that the price of fossil fuels is expected to increase. We use the predictions for fossil fuel increase that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has come with, and then we use the fact that we added on top of that the CO2 price that we have or the carbon price that we have in Europe. Our strategy has 2 different elements. One is energy efficiencies. Denmark is actually very efficient already. The OECD has calculated that when global energy prices increase, it's a competitive advantage for Denmark. Even so, we believe that there are a lot of areas, it isn't just we believe, there is scientific evidence that would be cost effective to increase the efficiency in these different sectors in this manner. I should say our models don't put in energy efficiency unless it's more, if it's less expensive to do energy efficiency than to increase the supply, then we do energy efficiency. If it's less expensive to increase the supply, then we increase the supply. What's our energy going to look like in the future? Our energy mix, I should start by saying the models assume the price relationship between the different technologies that's there today. So in that sense, I think probably something like solar is underestimated because I think it's going to get cheaper. But if we use the price relationship between technologies as it is today, if we say that the rest of the world is ambitious, this is our picture now, and my spin doctor taught me that all those little black dark colors, they're bad, they should go out, and we should put it in with the good colors. And we can see that wind and biomass, and of course solar and so on, but wind and biomass will play a very large role. If we assume that biomass prices aren't going to increase, then biomass will fill more in the picture, although we will have to import about half of the biomass that we actually need. Now, our ambitious scenario says that, or it predicts that in an ambitious world where biomass becomes expensive, we will probably only use biomass where there are no alternatives. In other words, we won't be using it for routine heat and electricity production, which is a problem because a lot of CO2 emission work now is going towards putting biomass in instead of coal. And this may be a problem because in the future, we think we're going to use it in the transport sector, the heavy transport sector where electricity is not a possibility, and in industry as a reserve for those processes that require temperatures that are higher than are easily obtained with electricity. And then as a backup. In other words, our system will first say, okay, we've got tons of wind energy. And then it'll say, okay, oops, we couldn't get any wind. Ah, there's some solar there. And then we will ask our neighbors up to the north for their hydropower. And if all else fails, then we'll go to the expensive resource, the biomass resource, and use biogas as a backup to make this system work. Now, our system in the future, we think, will be very much based on offshore wind. We're very fortunate in that extent, to transmission with our neighboring countries, some onshore wind. I should add that Denmark at the moment has a very modern and a country-wide energy system. It's a very effective system. It'll be relatively easy to change it, but 47% of our heating comes from district heating, which gives us, and we expect that to be more in the future, and that gives us some incredible opportunity already now to put in warm heat pumps that can soak up some of the extra electricity from here and be used for heat directly. So we have some advantages that a lot of other countries don't have. We had 40 recommendations. As I say, they're very Danish, so I won't go into them. I'm rounding up now, but they all focus on things that should be done within the next 10 to 15 years in order to establish the framework that will best allow market mechanisms to promote the transition. And people say, oh, well, let's just let the market do it. Listen, guys, the market does not operate in a vacuum. It operates within the framework that the politicians give it. And that's what our politicians are discussing now to give that framework. All of our recommendations are robust, whether or not you think the world's going to be ambitious or unambitious. And actually, they should be seen as a package. Because to change an energy system means that you have to have a lot of balls in the air at one time. A lot of buttons need to be pushed at once. And what I was afraid of with what we came with 40 recommendations. And I was afraid the government would say, we'll take 10, we're 25% of the way. That's not the way you can do it. You have to push all the buttons. And I am delighted to say that both the old and the new government in their proposals push all of the buttons. They don't push them as hard, some of them as we predicted or as we proposed, but our job wasn't to balance the economy in a financial crisis either. It was to say what would be best. But every single one of the buttons that we suggest is pushed by both of the government's recommendations. What are those buttons? Well, we need to improve energy efficiency, also in industry. People are always saying, oh, we can't do anything to hurt industry. But 40% of the, I think it is actually 40% of the energy used in Denmark is by company or is by industry. So we have to improve it there too. Establish infrastructure with green energy. Right now we can invest in wind. We don't know exactly how much wind we're going to need, but we're going to need more than we have now. Storage capacity in the system. Smart grid in the system or intelligence in the system, because in the old days we've only regulated on the supply side. Now we need to regulate both on the supply and the demand side. Expansion of transmission facilities, because we will use more electricity, long-term planning, also to increase the investment, people wanting to invest. We don't have a law yet about this in Denmark, but we have the stated goal of being independent of fossil fuels by 2050 from the politicians. There's no one in Denmark that will invest in a coal power plant, just on the basis of that. We need to revamp the tax system to see how we can use it to help us here. That is going on right now. Gain experience with new transport technologies, research and development, not least of which demonstration. Strategic planning, working in international fora, but we also need a law. We need a law so that when the government changes, we know that that goal is still in place. The new government is proposing a law. And most importantly, we need periodic evaluation of progress. How are we doing on this, and do we need to push some of the buttons harder? If we want to put all this in perspective, our planet was formed about 5 billion years ago. Our species has been here for something like 250,000 years, maybe only 200, but I divide 25 into 250,000 better than into 200. And so you could say there's been about 25 generations, assuming a 25-year generation time, and most of those generations lived in caves. About 6 to 8 generations ago, we humans replaced animal power with machines. That's when we had our friend Darwin in the picture. But none of those generations, in fact, not even our parents' generation, realized what that change was actually meaning and that it could be changing the habitat for our entire species. It's only in our generation that research has documented that the replacement of animal power with machine power is jeopardizing the human habitat. That knowledge is power. Knowledge, it gives us the power, and I would also argue the responsibility to change and to begin to manage the human-Earth relationship. It's a daunting task, but we need to become stewards of our own habitat. We don't get people to do that by communicating doomsday scenario, and I think we've been doing that too much. People need to understand what's in it for me. And as I say, most Danes understand it's important in terms of energy security to make this move. And I'd like to add on my own ticket, as it were, the trench warfare concerning climate has just got to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. I'm sure there will be many comments and questions. No.
Congratulations on a very ambitious and exciting agenda you've laid out there. Could you say more about the biomass? It seems very optimistic. If you look back in this country 5 or 6 years, we were all about corn ethanol and then decided that wasn't so great. We were also laying out much more ambitious commercialization futures for cellulosic biofuel. It just seems like an area that people are continually overly optimistic, don't anticipate all the side effects. You've got biomass being potentially playing a very large role in Denmark. Could you comment on that?
I would love to. Denmark has a rather unique situation. Denmark has 5.5 million people and 25 million pigs. And those pigs leave a lot behind. And biogas is something that is already playing a major role in Denmark. I don't expect liquid biofuels to play a major role. This is one of my problems in people focusing a lot only on emissions reductions. I know other countries have made very strict goals or ambitious goals about how much bioethanol they'll have in their transport system by 2020 or whatever in order to achieve their emission goals. And they may make their 2020 goal, but they're sure not going to solve their problem by 2050 by going that way. So I think the jury's not in yet about second and third generation. I think the jury's pretty much coming to a conclusion with respect to first generation and bioethanol. So I am very concerned about biomass. In most countries, both in Denmark and in this country, people wrongly equate support to biomass as being support to the farmers. And in Denmark, although many local politicians think support of biomass, burn biomass is support to the farmers, actually 87% of the biomass we burn is wood chips that we've imported. So, or wood pellets that we've imported. So I think the biomass is, we have to be really careful about biomass. And in fact, I just last week sent in a large application to a foundation to try and be able to do a study that actually kind of continues the planetary boundaries approach to looking at biomass to say, what are, if we assume, lots of studies have been done within the agricultural world. Oh, well, the technology can, or the efficiency and blah, 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 we can, or maybe we will, maybe we won't use more land and all that sort of stuff. But if we look at some of the biophysical constraints and the improvements we can make in agriculture, what do we think is the sustainable amount of biomass that we can take out of the system with respect to carbon sinks and all that sort of stuff, then use that number in economic models to look at there is a global biomass market that hasn't developed yet. We still have prices that are pretty local, although the feedbacks between what happened in the United States and Brazil and global wheat prices and so on is, it's clear there is a global market evolving. So biomass is going to be a topic of real discussion in the future, but most of this is pig shit.
Great talk, thank you very much. What will be the replacement feedstock for the plastics and fertilizers and other chemical non-burned fossil fuels, but chemically converted?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing about biomass is that I think we're going to end up, if we can't find, that's why I don't think we're going to burn it and, going to use it for routine heat and electricity production, because I think it will end up being our replacement for a lot of petrochemicals and a lot of petrochemical purposes. I know Lego is doing a lot of work at the moment to try and make Lego pieces out of biomass, and they can do it. They're just not as durable as the plastic ones. So we're working hard on that, and so I think people that get all excited about biomass in their own, super optimizing in their own little sector are completely missing the boat in terms of the global demand and the global market that will be for biomass. Never mind the fact that 9 billion people might want to eat too.
Back there, and then.
Okay, great.
I'm just curious, does the plan include anything on carbon capture and storage, whether to transition away from coal or to do negative emissions through biomass?
The plan does not include CCS for a couple of reasons. One, if you remove fossil fuels from the system, then we wouldn't need CCS. I have to be honest and say that the previous government kind of left a loophole in their goal of being independent. They kind of said, well, if CCS became viable, then we wouldn't at this point say we wouldn't use it, if you understand what I mean. In Europe, there's decreasing belief that CCS is going to actually get up and fly, for several reasons, but one of them, the two most important are there's a lot of public resistance, and some countries have said they simply won't do it in their own country, in their own countries. The other is, I think most people only see it as a transition solution, and it's terribly expensive, and it's also very energy costly. And if you're only going to use it for a short time, it's hard to get people to invest in it. Having said that, I really hope that research continues, because I think we are going to get into a position where we need to fish CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it would be really nice to have those techniques there. So I'm not wholly on this one, but it is not a part of our program. I should probably also have said, for those of you who don't know it, Denmark made a conscious decision in the 1970s not to have nuclear power, in spite of the fact that Niels Bohr came from our part of the world. And there's, we also considered in our study whether or not that was a bad mistake, that we should have said we would have nuclear power. Now, we came to the conclusion that it was not a solution for Denmark. The most important reasons for that was, A, it really is very expensive. B, It doesn't play together well with the with renewables, and we will have renewables. I mean, we have a lot of wind already. 23% of our electricity comes from wind. It doesn't play together well with fluctuating sources because it's not something you just come in at 10 o'clock on Monday morning and say, oh, I need 40% more and turn it up. I mean, it can be changed, but it's something that you have to look at very carefully, or be very careful with, and it does shorten the lifetime of the plant. The final reason, which I think is probably the most important, is the fact that Denmark gave up in the 70s. It has not continued to maintain its knowledge base regarding nuclear power. That means if we went over to nuclear power, we'd have to import everything, knowledge, equipment, and so on from other countries. Nobody can promise Denmark that Denmark will be able to earn money on this other agenda. But you can promise Denmark that if we're not going to compete on the nuclear power side of things. So if we want to see where we can compete energetically or compete on this and this agenda, then it'll be through the renewables and energy efficiency.
Sally?
Could you say a little bit more about the sort of technology pathways that you're envisioning for removing all fossil fuels from the transportation sector? You mentioned bio would be used for that, but could you say a little bit about what you're thinking about the technologies that would be available?
Yeah, transport is really, I'm reading that question as being mostly focused at the transport. Transport is the biggest challenge that we have to look at. And therefore, most politicians, and it's hardest to see what's the immediate, so what should we do about transport? And so most politicians have a tendency to say, oh, well, then we'll wait on that one. In fact, I think that's very problematic because that's the one area where the rest of us have to really change our behavior. I mean, I can't see whether the electrons coming out of that wall there are green or black. I'm going to plug in my computer in exactly the same way. And by the way, I should probably tell you that the largest energy company in Denmark in 2009, their profile was 85% of their power came from fossil fuels, 15% from renewables. In 2009, they said, we are going to turn that fraction around by 2040 and make it 85% renewable, 15% fossil fuels, and they set the goal of 2020 of being sort of 50% of the way, and they're ahead of schedule. When I tell people that, they shake their head and say, well, that's just because they think they're going to make money. Well, so? Anyway, I think we're going to get green electrons out of the wall, and you and I don't have to do anything. But in terms of changing our transport patterns, then we do have to do something. So right now, electric cars are coming into Denmark. They've been rolled out, and there is a national electric plug-in system, so you can drive around the country with and battery exchange or plugging in or whatever. So you can drive around the country in an electric car. Right now there's a campaign to get people to have their second car as an electric car because most families have two, and one is used for long-term stuff and the rest of it's used for running around locally, and people, that's one of the things they're looking at in the tax system is to try and make it advantageous. A lot of companies and actually communities, municipalities are buying as their fleet of cars for people to drive in at work, electric cars to give people experience in driving electric cars and discovering that it's just not really all that dangerous. I should say that in terms of long-distance transport, we didn't look at the aviation or shipping because we were only looking at things that we could use Danish law to change, and those are governed in other fora. So we believe that that electricity will be very important for personal transport, but that biogas or biofuels will be important for heavy transport in the future, and that we reserve in our models a certain amount of the biomass that we use for that purpose.
Noah, and then the gentleman in the back after.
So my question relates to this last point actually in terms of trade, and if you can tell us more about your definition of independence from fossil fuels and where imports come into that definition. And
we in Denmark have are very tightly coupled in Northern Europe to other countries. We buy and sell across borders. We will continue to do that, and in fact, The EU is looking to, I mean, basically, it'd be easier to solve this whole energy crisis thing if the EU looked at, we got our sun from Spain and we got our wind from Denmark and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of talk about making EU grids, and there has been an analysis that showed that, that would be the least expensive way to do this. So our definition is that we will still buy and sell across borders, and that means that we probably get nuclear from Germany as long as they have it, or from Sweden as long as they have it, and that's what an open economy is all about. But to be independent, so we say that no energy production in Denmark will be based on fossil fuels, and the amount of energy that we produce in Denmark with our renewables should be the equivalent of the amount that we actually use. Now we will, of the total amount that we use, but we will sell a lot of our renewable to other countries because you buy your energy where it's cheapest at the moment, and so other people buy our cheap wind power when we can't use it and so on. So in the first instance, we don't close down the open market that we have. We buy and sell over borders, but we produce only renewables in Denmark, and we produce the same amount that we use. Independence being in that way, if suddenly we couldn't get from anybody else, we'd have our own.
So am I correct that the independence doesn't include embodied emissions of goods that are...
No, it doesn't. It's just the energy system. Yeah.
Okay, gentleman standing, and then after the gentleman sitting.
Just a couple of corrections. Charles Darwin's grandfather actually explained to him that he thought himself that all life stemmed from a common filament. That was the term he used. So that Darwin had quite a bit of background in developing his theory, and spent 30 years actually doing a lot of analysis. So it wasn't a new idea with Darwin. It was actually a fairly old idea.
It was society's response came to Darwin and not to his grandfather.
Yeah, that's right, and Mendel and so forth. So
Climate's
the other
been
thing
around
is
for a while too, thanks to Fournier.
The other thing is that there's clear evidence that we've actually had control of fire for about 400,000 years. So I think we have to push our species' existence back a little bit. And that our farming actually was under control about 6,000 years ago in the Middle East. But I have a question.
So 6,000 is still within my 12,000.
I want everybody to think that 2,000 years is when farming started. So
I meant 2,000 years into the Holocene. So
okay.
Sorry.
Okay,
Not
good.
2,000 years
Good.
ago.
Very good.
2,000 years after the beginning of the Holocene.
Very good. Okay.
Yes.
So now the question is, your wind power is about 23%, you said, of current generation.
Yeah.
What is the actual capacity factor of that? In other words, how many kilowatt hours per year do you actually get for a given investment in nameplate capacity? No.
I'm going to have to go back to the report for that one. I'm sorry. I can't do the numbers I can't remember the numbers offhand, but we have them all. Yeah, sorry.
I would like to ask you a simple question that will point out a major difference between Denmark and the United States. What fraction of your population lives in København, in Copenhagen?
Well, about half. Yeah. I mean, I started my talk by saying that I don't think the Danish situation is applicable to I'm not coming here to preach and say I think you should do it. What I'm saying is that sooner or later it has to happen. So the analysis of how, in this country, is it going to happen? It's probably not going to happen as a whole country. It's going to happen by regions, and if it's going to happen by regions, who needs to get together to talk about it? Who needs to? The big problem in all this is that energy infrastructure lasts 30, 40, 50 years. So what we're building today, we're going to have to live with for the next decades, and if we don't take into account what may happen in that period, we may be actually making very bad investments. And that's all I'm arguing. I'm not saying that it's easy in Denmark. It's easy in Denmark for many reasons. Also, we're a welfare state. So we have a modern energy infrastructure that covers the whole country. We make decisions in an entirely different way than we do in this country. We don't walk in New York and not be able to see where we're going because there's so much leaking out of the system down below. I mean, there are very big and major differences that I respect, but I still think the question of can we do it? We have to sooner or later. When do we start the journey? I think that's relevant for everyone.
Chris Field, it will be your last question.
Do you have a feel for how important it is for your economic growth projections that Denmark has the stature as a real technology leader, so that if Korea was the technology leader, would the economic growth be slower?
Well, I'm unsure. Are you asking about the economic growth of Denmark or the costs of
the economic? So you showed that without having fossil fuel in the system, Denmark grows.
Oh, we're not assuming in any way in these models that it's a buy Denmark clause. If it's cheaper to buy it from Korea, we'll buy it from Korea.
But there must be something in the economic growth projections about Denmark's export sales of energy technology know-how.
Well, I don't think I think, to be perfectly honest, that when the finance ministry predicts the growth rate, they basically use the current. They continue the current and then put the global estimates of what the conjuncture is going to be like globally on it. I don't think they actually go in and say, yes, 50% is going to come from farming and 20% from paper or whatever. So there's not built into that 1.7% growth that it will necessarily be coming from energy. Although that particular part of the export has actually fared better in the past few years than many of the other other points. But none of that is in our study at all. We just take, if the government says it's going to be a 1.7% per year per annum growth rate, we use it in the models. We did do a sensitivity analysis of, if it was the half or the double, I have to say.
Okay, let's thank really Katherine for feeding us with the energy and optimism.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.